I'm Jessica Thompson, and I never imagined I'd be standing in an Ohio courtroom, my hands shaking as I held a manila envelope containing recordings that would expose my own sister's lies. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Amanda sat across the aisle, cradling her 2-month-old baby, the infant she'd named after my deceased daughter, the same daughter who died in my arms 3 years ago. Amanda's lawyer shuffled papers confidently, probably thinking this was just another family dispute over hurt feelings, but they had no idea what was really at stake here. This wasn't about a name. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. This wasn't about honoring memory. This was about $250,000, and my sister had used my dead child as a pawn to get it. The judge hadn't heard the recording yet, the one where Amanda laughed about her brilliant plan to manipulate our grieving father. As I watched her rock little Lily Rose Davis, wearing that practiced expression of wounded innocence, my stomach churned. She had no idea I'd been recording our conversations for weeks. The envelope felt heavy in my hands, weighted with the truth that would shatter her carefully constructed facade. In 30 minutes, everyone in this courtroom would know what kind of person Amanda really was. But first, let me tell you how we got here, because this story will change how you think about family forever. The call came on a Tuesday evening in March, just as I was grading spelling tests at my kitchen table. My sister Amanda's voice bubbled through the phone with an excitement I hadn't heard since before Lily died. Michael was washing dishes, the familiar routine of our quiet life since we lost our daughter 3 years ago. We'd fallen into these peaceful rhythms, finding small comforts in the ordinary moments that used to feel mundane back when our world was full of a 5-year-old's laughter and chaos. Amanda's words hit me like ice water. She was pregnant, 7 months along, and she had something special to tell me. Her voice carried that particular breathless quality she got when she thought she was being incredibly thoughtful. The baby was a girl, she announced, and she'd chosen the perfect name to honor our family. My pencil froze over Tommy Martinez's misspelled assignment as she continued talking, her words becoming distant and muffled as my mind struggled to process what I was hearing. Lily Rose. She was naming her daughter Lily Rose, the same name as my daughter. My beautiful, vibrant, impossible daughter, who used to dance around this very kitchen in her Princess Elsa dress, who died clutching her favorite stuffed elephant when a drunk driver ran a red light on Maple Street, the daughter whose name was carved into pink granite at St. Mary's Cemetery, whose bedroom I still couldn't bear to change, whose memory was so sacred to me that I whispered her name like a prayer every morning when I woke up. Amanda's voice kept going, explaining how she wanted to honor Lily's memory, how she thought it would bring healing to our family, how she was sure I'd be touched by the gesture. She painted it as this beautiful tribute, this way of keeping my daughter's spirit alive. But something in her tone felt rehearsed, like she'd practiced this conversation in the mirror. There was a calculation behind her words that made my skin crawl, though I couldn't quite name it yet. Michael turned from the sink when he heard me gasp, dish towel still in his hands, his eyes immediately concerned. 3 years of marriage to a grieving mother had taught him to read the subtle signs of my distress. I held up a finger, trying to stay focused on Amanda's monologue about how meaningful this would be, how it would help us all heal together. The kitchen felt like it was spinning around me. When I finally found my voice, it came out smaller than I intended. I asked her if she'd thought about how this might feel for me, and Michael, hearing another child called by our daughter's name, Amanda's response was swift and dismissive. She said she was surprised I wasn't more grateful, that most people would be honored to have their child's memory preserved this way. She made it sound like I was being selfish, like my grief was somehow standing in the way of this beautiful family moment she was trying to create. The conversation ended with Amanda promising we'd talk more soon, her voice already moving on to other topics, nursery decorations and baby shower plans. She hung up before I could fully process what had just happened, leaving me sitting in my kitchen with a red pen in my hand and tears streaming down my face. Michael crossed the room immediately, pulling me into his arms as I tried to explain what Amanda had just told me. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, trying to understand the knot of emotions in my chest. Part of me wanted to believe Amanda's explanation, that this really was about honoring Lily's memory. My sister had always been dramatic, prone to grand gestures that she thought were deeply meaningful. Maybe this was just another example of her impulsive nature, her tendency to make decisions without fully thinking through the consequences. But another part of me, the part that had known Amanda since we were children sharing a bunk bed in our parents' house, recognized something familiar in her tone. It was the same voice she'd used when she convinced our parents to let her borrow the car by promising she was only going to the library when she was actually meeting boys at the mall. The same calculated sweetness she'd employed when she wanted something, but knew the direct approach wouldn't work. Over the next few weeks, I tried to give Amanda the benefit of the doubt. I told myself that maybe I was reading too much into things, that grief was making me paranoid and suspicious. When she invited me to lunch to talk more about the baby, I went hoping we could find some middle ground, some way to navigate this that wouldn't feel like a knife through my heart every time someone called her daughter's name. We met at Riverside Diner, the same place we'd had countless sister lunches over the years, where Amanda used to help me practice my wedding vows, and where I'd cried over my fertility struggles before Lily was conceived. The familiar red vinyl booths and smell of coffee should have been comforting, but everything felt different now. Amanda looked radiant in that way pregnant women do, her hand resting protectively over her rounded belly, as she ordered a decaf coffee and started talking about nursery themes. She seemed genuinely confused by my distress, insisting that naming her daughter Lily Rose was the most natural thing in the world. She talked about how our children would be like sisters, how beautiful it would be for them to share a name, how it would create this special bond between our families. The way she spoke, it was as if my Lily was just temporarily away, as if death was some minor inconvenience that could be overcome through the magic of shared names. When I tried to explain how painful it would be to hear another child called by my daughter's name, Amanda's expression shifted slightly. The sweet, understanding mask slipped for just a moment, and I caught a glimpse of something harder underneath. She told me I needed to stop living in the past, that holding on to grief so tightly wasn't healthy. She said she was trying to help me heal, and that I was being ungrateful and selfish. The conversation deteriorated from there. Amanda accused me of trying to own a name, of acting like I had some monopoly on honoring our family. She said hurtful things about how I'd isolated myself since Lily's death, how I'd pushed people away and made everything about my loss. Some of what she said had grains of truth that stung worse than outright lies. I had withdrawn from family gatherings, had stopped participating in holiday celebrations, had built walls around my grief that kept even well-meaning people at a distance. But as Amanda's voice grew more heated, I began to hear something else underneath her argument.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
She kept mentioning Dad, bringing up how happy he'd be to have another Lily in the family, how much it would mean to him to see his granddaughter's name carried on. She talked about family legacy and keeping memories alive in ways that felt less about honoring my daughter and more about positioning herself as the keeper of family tradition. That's when I started to wonder if there was more to this than Amanda's claimed desire to honor Lily's memory. My sister had always been competitive, always needed to be the center of attention at family gatherings. Since Lily's death, I'd been the recipient of Dad's extra concern and care, the daughter who needed support and understanding. Amanda had stood on the sidelines, watching our father's attention focus on my grief and recovery. The lunch ended badly, with Amanda storming out after telling me I had two choices: accept her decision gracefully or miss out on being part of her daughter's life. She left me sitting in the booth, my untouched sandwich growing cold, wondering how the sister who used to braid my hair and share her Halloween candy had become someone I barely recognized. That evening, Michael and I sat on our back porch, watching the sunset over the neighborhood, where Lily used to ride her bicycle and play with the neighbor kids. I told him about my conversation with Amanda, about the nagging feeling that there was something she wasn't telling me. Michael had always been more suspicious of my sister's motives than I was. He'd watched her manipulate family situations before, had seen how she could twist conversations to make herself the victim, while getting exactly what she wanted. He reminded me about Christmas 2 years ago, when Amanda had convinced our parents to change their annual vacation plans because she'd double booked herself and needed them to babysit her friend's dog. She'd made it sound like a favor to the friend, a charitable act that required family sacrifice, when really she just hadn't wanted to miss a party in Columbus. She had a gift for reframing her selfish choices as noble gestures. As we talked, I began to remember other conversations, other moments when Amanda had seemed to be calculating something beyond what she was actually saying. She'd asked pointed questions about Dad's will after Mom died 2 years ago, had made comments about the lake house and whether it was fair for one person to inherit everything. At the time, I'd assumed she was just processing grief in her own way, but now those conversations took on a different meaning. The lake house had been in our family for 40 years, a modest but valuable property on Buckeye Lake where we'd spent every summer of our childhood. Dad had always planned to leave it to me, partly because I was the older daughter, and partly because I was the one who'd maintained it over the years, who'd spent weekends there with Lily, who'd kept up with repairs and property taxes. It was worth nearly $300,000 now, a significant inheritance that would secure Michael's and my future. But Amanda had been making noises lately about fairness, about how inheritance should be split equally regardless of who had put in more work. She'd mentioned it casually at family dinners, dropped comments about how family property should benefit everyone equally. At the time, I'd thought she was just being philosophical, but now I wondered if she was laying groundwork for a bigger conversation. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that Amanda's baby announcement had come just weeks after Dad had mentioned updating his will. He'd been talking about making things official, getting his affairs in order while he was healthy. The timing felt too convenient to be coincidental. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I decided to start paying closer attention to Amanda's words, to the things she said, and the way she said them. If my sister was planning something, if this baby naming situation was part of some larger manipulation, I wanted to be prepared. I had no idea that within weeks, I'd be collecting evidence that would expose Amanda's scheme in ways I never could have imagined. The next morning, I called Karen Mitchell, my best friend and fellow teacher at Riverside Elementary. Karen had known our family for 15 years, had been at Lily's funeral, had watched Amanda's behavior at family gatherings with the sharp eye of someone who'd spent decades managing classroom dynamics and spotting manipulation from a mile away. If anyone could help me figure out whether I was being paranoid or perceptive, it was Karen. We met for coffee at the small cafe near school, the same place where we'd spent countless mornings discussing lesson plans and student challenges, but today's conversation was different. I told Karen about Amanda's phone call, about the lunch conversation, about my growing suspicion that there was more to this situation than met the eye. Karen listened with the same careful attention she gave to parents explaining their children's behavior, asking pointed questions and taking mental notes. When I finished talking, Karen was quiet for a long moment, stirring her coffee and staring out the window at the elementary school playground where Lily used to swing during recess. Finally, she looked at me with an expression I recognized from parent-teacher conferences when she was about to deliver difficult news. Karen told me she'd been wondering when I'd finally see what she'd been noticing for months. Amanda had been asking strange questions at family gatherings, probing for information about Dad's finances and future plans. She'd been particularly interested in the lake house, asking about property values and inheritance laws with the kind of casual curiosity that wasn't casual at all. Karen had also noticed how Amanda positioned herself at family events, always making sure she was the one helping Dad with tasks, the one offering support and assistance. More troubling, Karen had overheard a conversation between Amanda and her husband David at a family barbecue last summer. They'd been standing near the kitchen window, thinking no one could hear them, discussing strategies for making sure Amanda got her fair share of family assets. David had seemed uncomfortable with the conversation, but Amanda had been insistent, talking about how she needed to secure her children's future and couldn't rely on Dad's favoritism toward me. The conversation had stuck with Karen because of its calculated tone. Amanda wasn't just worried about fairness, she was actively strategizing about how to manipulate family dynamics to her advantage. The fact that she was now naming her baby after my deceased daughter took on an entirely different meaning in that context. Karen and I spent the rest of our coffee meeting talking through Amanda's potential motives and strategies. If my sister was trying to position herself as the more devoted daughter, the one who truly honored family memory, then naming her baby Lily Rose was a brilliant psychological move. It would make any objection from me look petty and selfish, while positioning her as the keeper of family tradition and memory. Dad would be emotionally moved by the gesture, might see it as a sign that Amanda had matured into someone who understood the importance of family legacy. In his grief over losing his granddaughter, the prospect of another little Lily might cloud his judgment about Amanda's true motivations. It was exactly the kind of emotional manipulation that could influence inheritance decisions, especially if Amanda played her cards right. By the time we finished talking, I had a clearer picture of what might be happening, but I still didn't have proof. Karen suggested I start documenting conversations with Amanda, keeping track of the things she said and the way she positioned her arguments. If my sister really was running a long-term manipulation campaign, eventually she'd reveal her true motives. The trick was being ready to catch those moments when they happened. That afternoon, I drove out to the lake house, using my key to let myself into the quiet, familiar space where Lily and I had spent so many happy weekends. The house smelled like pine and old wood, filled with decades of family memories. I walked through the rooms, remembering summer afternoons when Amanda and I were kids, swimming off the dock and staying up late telling ghost stories. It was hard to reconcile those memories with the calculating woman I'd had lunch with a few days earlier, but as I stood in the living room, looking out at the lake that had been the backdrop for so many family moments, I realized something important. This house represented more than just financial security. It was the last tangible connection I had to the life Lily and I had built together, the place where my daughter had learned to fish with her grandfather, where she'd picked wild flowers and built sandcastles. If Amanda succeeded in forcing a sale or claiming half the inheritance, I'd lose more than money. I'd lose the physical space where Lily's memory felt most alive. That realization hardened my resolve. If Amanda wanted to use my daughter's name as part of some inheritance scheme, she was going to discover that she'd picked the wrong target. I might be grieving, but I wasn't helpless, and I was about to prove that protecting family memory meant more than just choosing the right baby name. Standing in that lake house, surrounded by 40 years of family history, I made a decision that would set everything else in motion. I was going to find out exactly what Amanda was planning, and I was going to stop her. The only question was whether I could gather enough evidence to expose her scheme before she succeeded in manipulating Dad into changing his will. The race was on, and my sister had no idea that her carefully constructed plan was about to unravel in the most public way possible. 2 weeks after my conversation with Karen, Amanda called to invite me to her baby shower. Her voice carried that forced brightness I'd started recognizing, the tone she used when she wanted something but was pretending to be casual about it. The shower was planned for Saturday afternoon at her house in Riverside Estates, and she made a point of mentioning how much it would mean to her if I came. She talked about how this was a chance for our family to come together, to celebrate new life and healing. Every word felt carefully chosen, designed to make me feel guilty if I declined. I almost said no. The thought of sitting in Amanda's living room, listening to guests coo over baby gifts while discussing the name Lily Rose, made my stomach clench with anxiety, but something Karen had said during our coffee meeting stuck with me. If Amanda was really running some kind of long-term manipulation, the baby shower would be where she'd perform for our extended family, where she'd cement the narrative about honoring our daughter's memory. I needed to see that performance for myself. Michael wasn't thrilled about my decision to attend. He'd grown protective of my emotional well-being over the past 3 years, quick to identify situations that might trigger my grief or cause me distress. The idea of watching me sit through a celebration of another baby named Lily Rose felt cruel to him, but he also understood my need to gather information, to figure out what Amanda was really planning. He offered to come with me for moral support, but I declined. This was something I needed to handle on my own. The morning of the shower, I stood in front of my closet for 20 minutes, trying to decide what to wear to celebrate a baby who shared my dead daughter's name. Everything felt wrong. Bright colors seemed inappropriate, like I was pretending to be happy about something that broke my heart. Dark colors would make me look like I was mourning at a celebration, which would give Amanda ammunition to paint me as the bitter sister who couldn't move past her grief. I finally settled on a simple blue dress, something neutral that wouldn't draw attention. Amanda's house sat in the newer development on the outskirts of Riverside, a neighborhood of cookie-cutter colonials with perfectly manicured lawns and two-car garages. She'd moved there after marrying David, trading the modest apartment she'd lived in during her 20s for suburban respectability. The house always felt too big for just two people, with its formal dining room and guest bedrooms that rarely saw visitors. Now it would be filled with the chaos of a newborn, though somehow I doubted Amanda had fully considered what that would mean for her carefully curated lifestyle. Cars lined the street when I arrived, license plates I recognized from family gatherings and others that belonged to Amanda's work friends and neighbors. Through the front window, I could see pink and white decorations, balloons and streamers that announced this celebration was for a daughter. My chest tightened as I walked up the front path, steeling myself for whatever performance Amanda had planned. The house buzzed with female voices and laughter when Amanda opened the door. She looked radiant in a flowing maternity dress, her hand resting on her belly in that unconscious gesture pregnant women make. Her smile was warm and genuine as she hugged me, and for a moment I wondered if I'd been overthinking everything. Maybe this really was just about wanting to honor Lily's memory. Maybe my grief had made me paranoid and suspicious of innocent gestures. But as Amanda led me through the crowd of guests, introducing me as the aunt the baby was named after, I began to pick up on subtle cues that confirmed my suspicions. She wasn't just mentioning the name casually. She was making it a centerpiece of every conversation, telling the story of little Lily Rose Thompson with dramatic flair, painting herself as the devoted aunt who wanted to keep precious memories alive. She talked about my daughter with the kind of reverent tone usually reserved for saints or martyrs, making the naming decision sound like a sacred duty rather than a personal choice. What made it worse was how the other guests responded. They looked at me with that particular expression people get around the bereaved, a mixture of sympathy and discomfort that I'd learned to recognize over the past 3 years. They praised Amanda for her thoughtfulness, told her how beautiful it was that she wanted to honor family memory this way. Several guests mentioned how healing this must be for me, how wonderful it was that my daughter's name would live on through Amanda's baby. I smiled and nodded through these conversations, playing the part of the grateful sister who was touched by this gesture. But inside, I felt like I was watching a play where everyone knew their lines except me. Amanda had created a narrative where she was the heroine preserving family tradition, and I was cast as the grieving mother who would naturally be comforted by this act of remembrance. Any objection I raised would make me look ungrateful and petty. The worst part came during the gift opening, when Amanda opened a package containing a silver bracelet engraved with Lily Rose Davis. She held it up for everyone to see, explaining how she planned to give it to her daughter when she was older, along with stories about the special little girl she was named after. The guests murmured appreciatively, and someone suggested that maybe I could help tell those stories, could share memories of my Lily with Amanda's daughter as she grew up. Amanda seized on this suggestion immediately, turning to me with bright eyes and talking about how wonderful it would be for the two Lily Roses to be connected across time. She painted this picture of family continuity, of love transcending death, of children bound together by shared names and shared stories. It sounded beautiful when she said it, and I could see how the other guests were moved by her words. But something about the way she watched my reaction, the way she seemed to be gauging my response, made me feel like I was being tested. That's when I noticed Dad sitting in the corner, his eyes bright with unshed tears as he listened to Amanda talk about preserving Lily's memory. At 72, my father had aged visibly since losing his granddaughter, the grief settling into deep lines around his eyes and a stoop to his shoulders that hadn't been there before. He'd adored Lily, had spent hours teaching her to fish at the lake house, reading her stories on the old porch swing. Losing her had broken something fundamental in him, a joy that I wasn't sure could ever be fully repaired. Now, watching Amanda perform this elaborate tribute to his dead granddaughter, Dad looked more animated than I'd seen him in months. He was buying into the narrative completely, seeing this as a beautiful way to honor Lily's memory and bring the family together in healing. When Amanda asked him to say a few words about what the name meant to our family, he stood up with tears in his eyes and talked about legacy, about love that never dies, about the blessing of having another little Lily to cherish. I realized in that moment exactly how brilliant Amanda's strategy was. She wasn't just positioning herself as the keeper of family memory, she was offering Dad something he desperately wanted, a way to feel like Lily wasn't completely gone. The prospect of another little girl with that name, another chance to teach someone to fish and tell bedtime stories, was like a lifeline to a drowning man. Dad would do anything to protect and support this new Lily Rose, including making sure her mother had the resources to provide for her properly. As the afternoon wore on, I found myself paying closer attention to the conversations happening around me. Amanda's friends from work talked about how lucky she was to be having a daughter, how excited she must be to decorate a nursery and plan for dance lessons and princess parties. But when the conversation turned to practical matters like childcare costs and college savings, Amanda's tone shifted. She mentioned how expensive it was to raise children these days, how she hoped her family would be able to help with some of the bigger expenses. One of her neighbors asked about David's job at the insurance company, whether he was doing well enough to handle the financial pressures of a new baby. Amanda's response was carefully crafted to suggest some concern without seeming like she was complaining. She talked about how they were managing for now, but that long-term security was always a worry. She mentioned hoping that family assets could eventually help provide for little Lily Rose's future, ensuring she had every opportunity to thrive. The conversation moved on quickly, but I caught the underlying message. Amanda was already laying groundwork for the idea that this baby deserved family financial support, that ensuring little Lily Rose's future was a family obligation rather than just a parental responsibility. She was connecting the baby's name to the family's financial resources, suggesting that honoring memory meant more than just emotional gestures. Later, when most of the guests had gone home and I was helping Amanda clean up, she brought up Dad's will directly for the first time. She mentioned it casually, in the context of talking about planning for the baby's future, but her words were clearly calculated. She said she hoped Dad was thinking about how his decisions would affect his granddaughter, how important it was that little Lily Rose would be provided for throughout her life. When I didn't respond immediately, Amanda pressed a little harder. She talked about fairness, about how inheritance should reflect current family needs rather than old assumptions. She pointed out that she was the one having children now, the one who would need financial support for things like education and healthcare. She made it sound reasonable, even generous, like she was just looking out for the family's future welfare. But what struck me most was how she framed everything in terms of little Lily Rose's needs rather than her own wants. She wasn't asking for money for herself, she was advocating for her daughter's future. She wasn't challenging Dad's will out of greed, she was ensuring that his granddaughter would be properly cared for. It was a masterful piece of emotional manipulation, using the baby's name and the connection to my daughter's memory to justify what was essentially a grab for inheritance money. The conversation was interrupted when David came home from running errands, his arms full of grocery bags and his expression slightly strained. I'd always liked Amanda's husband, a quiet, steady man who seemed genuinely devoted to her despite her more dramatic tendencies. But lately he'd seemed uncomfortable at family gatherings, like he was watching Amanda perform rather than simply being herself. As Amanda continued talking about family financial planning and the importance of providing for little Lily Rose, I noticed David's body language. He set down the grocery bags with more force than necessary, his jaw tight as he listened to his wife's monologue about inheritance and family obligations. When Amanda mentioned how meaningful it would be if Dad updated his will to reflect current family circumstances, David actually winced. After a few minutes, David excused himself to put away groceries, and Amanda followed him into the kitchen. I could hear them having a low-voiced conversation, though I couldn't make out the specific words. David's tone sounded frustrated, while Amanda's voice carried that edge of impatience she got when someone questioned her plans. The conversation ended abruptly when they realized I might be able to hear them, but the tension between them was obvious when they returned to the living room. As I got ready to leave, Amanda walked me to the door, her hand resting on her belly as she talked about how excited she was for me to meet baby Lily Rose when she arrived. She mentioned again how much it would mean to her if I could help tell stories about my daughter, could help create that connection between the two girls across time. Her words were sweet, but there was something in her eyes that reminded me of the calculating look I'd seen at our lunch a few weeks earlier. Driving home through the familiar streets of Riverside, I thought about everything I'd observed at the shower. Amanda wasn't just naming her baby after my daughter out of sentimental impulse. She was executing a carefully planned strategy designed to position herself as the most devoted daughter, the one most deserving of family resources. She was using Lily's name and memory as tools in a larger campaign to influence Dad's inheritance decisions. The most disturbing part was how effective her strategy was likely to be. Dad was already emotionally invested in the idea of another little Lily Rose, already seeing this baby as a way to heal from his grief over losing his granddaughter. Amanda had created a situation where any objection to her plans would look like I was opposing family healing, like I was putting my own hurt feelings ahead of everyone else's happiness. When I got home, Michael was waiting in the kitchen with a cup of coffee and a concerned expression. He could read my mood from across the room, could see the mixture of anger and sadness I was carrying. I told him about the shower, about Amanda's performance and Dad's reaction, about the subtle ways she'd worked inheritance talk into conversations about baby planning. Michael listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker as I described Amanda's tactics. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment before asking the question I'd been dreading to face directly: what was I going to do about it? I could expose Amanda's manipulation to Dad, could try to make him see that her motives weren't as pure as they appeared. But would he believe me, or would it look like jealous sister rivalry, like I couldn't handle another child sharing my daughter's name? That night, I lay awake thinking about the other people who would be affected by Amanda's scheme. Dad, who was being emotionally manipulated during his time of grief, who might make financial decisions based on false premises about Amanda's devotives. David, who seemed increasingly uncomfortable with his wife's behavior but felt trapped between loyalty to her and his own moral compass. Even Amanda's unborn baby, who would grow up carrying a name chosen not out of love but as part of a calculated plan to secure inheritance money. But mostly, I thought about Lily, my beautiful innocent daughter who had died believing in the goodness of family, who had trusted everyone completely and loved without reservation. Amanda was using Lily's memory as a weapon, turning something sacred into something mercenary. She was teaching her own daughter that family relationships were transactional, that love could be leveraged for financial gain. By morning, I had made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to let Amanda succeed in manipulating Dad through emotional exploitation. I wasn't going to stand by while she used my dead daughter's name to secure inheritance money that rightfully belonged elsewhere. And I wasn't going to allow Lily's memory to be twisted into something ugly and calculating. But I also knew I needed to be smart about how I approached this. Amanda had spent months, maybe years, laying the groundwork for her strategy. She had positioned herself cleverly, created a narrative that painted her as the devoted sister and me as the bitter, grieving mother. If I wanted to expose her real motives, I needed proof that was undeniable, evidence that would show Dad exactly who Amanda really was. Over the next few days, I started paying attention to things I'd previously ignored. I noticed how Amanda positioned herself at family gatherings, always the one helping Dad with tasks, always the one offering assistance and support. I noticed how she brought up financial concerns in casual conversation, mentioning things like rising healthcare costs and education expenses in ways that seemed innocent but were clearly designed to plant seeds about future family financial obligations. Most importantly, I started documenting these conversations. I began keeping a notebook where I recorded the things Amanda said, the ways she framed her arguments, the subtle methods she used to connect the baby's name to family financial discussions. I wasn't sure yet how I would use this information, but I had a feeling that eventually, Amanda would reveal her true motives in ways that couldn't be denied or explained away. The notebook became my secret weapon, a growing collection of evidence that showed the calculated nature of Amanda's campaign. Every phone call, every family dinner, every casual conversation provided new examples of how she was manipulating family relationships for financial gain. I was building a case, piece by piece, that would eventually expose the truth about Amanda's real motives. What I didn't know was that within weeks, I would have recordings that made my notebook evidence look tame by comparison. Amanda was about to reveal the full extent of her scheme in ways that would shock everyone who heard them. But first, she had to give birth to the baby whose name would become the centerpiece of the biggest family confrontation our family had ever experienced. The next phase of Amanda's plan was about to begin, and I was going to be ready for it. My sister had no idea that her carefully constructed manipulation was about to unravel in the most devastating way possible. The game was just getting started, and this time, I was going to win. The phone call came at 2 in the morning on a Thursday in late April. Amanda had gone into labor 3 weeks early, and David's voice on the other end sounded exhausted and stressed as he told me they were at Riverside General Hospital. He didn't ask me to come, just informed me of the situation with the detached tone of someone fulfilling an obligation rather than sharing joyful news. I could hear hospital sounds in the background, the beeping of machines and distant voices, and somewhere beneath it all, Amanda's voice demanding something from a nurse. Michael stirred beside me as I hung up the phone, asking groggily what was happening. When I told him Amanda was in labor, he simply squeezed my hand and said he'd be awake if I needed him. We both knew this was a complicated moment, the arrival of a baby who would carry my daughter's name into the world. Part of me felt I should go to the hospital, should be there for my sister during this significant life event. But another part of me, the part that had been documenting Amanda's manipulation for weeks, couldn't bring myself to rush to her side and play the role of supportive older sister. I stayed home that night, lying awake and thinking about what this birth would mean for our family. In a few hours, there would be another Lily Rose in the world, a living, breathing child who would grow up answering to the name my daughter had carried for 5 precious years. Every time someone called that name at family gatherings, I would flinch, remembering the little girl who used to run to me when I said those words. Every birthday party, every Christmas morning, Every ordinary moment would be colored by the ghost of my daughter's memory. The sun was rising when David called again to say that baby Lily Rose Davis had been born at 6:43 in the morning, weighing 7 pounds and 4 ounces. He shared these details mechanically, like he was reading from a checklist, rather than announcing his daughter's arrival. There was no joy in his voice, no excitement about becoming a father. Instead, he sounded tired and defeated, like a man who had just participated in something he wasn't entirely comfortable with. When I asked if Amanda was okay, David paused before answering. He said she was fine physically, that the delivery had gone smoothly despite being early. But there was something in his silence that spoke volumes. I could hear him moving away from the hospital room, his footsteps echoing in what sounded like a hallway, seeking privacy for whatever he wanted to say next. David's voice dropped lower, as he told me he needed to talk to me about something, but not over the phone and not at the hospital. He asked if we could meet somewhere private in the next few days, somewhere Amanda wouldn't know about. The urgency in his request caught me off guard. David had always been Amanda's loyal supporter, the steady husband who stood by her decisions even when they seemed impulsive or self-centered. For him to reach out to me secretly suggested that something significant had shifted in his perspective. We arranged to meet at the lake house on Saturday afternoon, when Amanda would be home with the baby and too occupied with new motherhood to question David's whereabouts. He said he'd tell her he was running errands and taking some time to decompress after the stress of the delivery. The secrecy of it all made me uneasy, but also confirmed my suspicions that there was more happening beneath the surface than Amanda wanted anyone to see. The next 2 days crawled by with painful slowness. Family members called to congratulate me on becoming an aunt again, their voices bright with excitement about the baby's arrival. Several relatives mentioned how wonderful it was that Amanda had chosen to honor Lily's memory this way, how healing it must be for our family to have another little girl with that special name. Each conversation felt like sandpaper against my grief, wearing away at my composure until I wanted to scream the truth about Amanda's manipulation. Dad visited the hospital on Friday, coming by my house afterward with tears in his eyes and photos of the baby on his phone. He looked more alive than I'd seen him since Lily's funeral, his face lit up with grandfatherly pride and joy. He showed me picture after picture of the newborn, pointing out features that reminded him of Amanda as a baby, talking about all the things he wanted to teach this new little Lily Rose as she grew up. Watching my father's reaction, I understood just how completely Amanda's strategy had succeeded. Dad wasn't just happy about having another grandchild, he saw this baby as a direct connection to the granddaughter he'd lost. The name wasn't just a tribute in his mind, it was a kind of resurrection, a way to reclaim some of what death had stolen from him. He talked about taking little Lily Rose to the lake house, teaching her to fish off the same dock where my Lily had learned, reading her the same bedtime stories he'd once read to my daughter. The pain of watching Dad transfer his love for my child onto Amanda's baby was almost unbearable. But what made it worse was knowing that Amanda had orchestrated this exact response. She had calculated how the name would affect our father, had predicted his emotional vulnerability and exploited it for her own purposes. She had turned Dad's grief into a tool for manipulating his affection and ultimately his financial decisions. When I tried gently suggesting that maybe having another Lily Rose in the family might be confusing or emotionally complicated, Dad dismissed my concerns immediately. He said that love wasn't a finite resource, that honoring memory didn't diminish what had been lost. He talked about how important it was for families to stick together, to support each other through joy and sorrow. His words were kind, but they carried an implicit message. I was expected to embrace this situation, to celebrate Amanda's choice regardless of my own feelings. That conversation with Dad crystallized something I'd been slowly realizing over the past few weeks. Amanda hadn't just manipulated the situation to gain financial advantage, she had also positioned me as the obstacle to family healing. If I objected to the baby's name, I was the one standing in the way of our collective recovery from grief. If I expressed hurt or anger about Amanda's choices, I was the one being selfish and unable to move forward. She had created a scenario where any resistance from me would make me look like the villain in our family story. Saturday afternoon arrived with the kind of spring weather that Ohio does best, warm sunshine and fresh breezes that made the world feel full of possibility. I drove out to the lake house with a mixture of anxiety and anticipation, wondering what David needed to tell me in such secrecy. The house looked peaceful in the afternoon light, its familiar outline against the blue sky evoking countless memories of family summers and holiday gatherings. David's car was already parked in the gravel driveway when I arrived, and I found him sitting on the back deck overlooking the water. He looked older than I remembered, stress etched into lines around his mouth and eyes. He held a beer that appeared mostly untouched, his gaze fixed on the lake's surface as if searching for answers in the gentle waves. When he heard me approach, David stood and gave me a brief hug before gesturing to one of the weathered Adirondack chairs that had sat on this deck for as long as I could remember. We sat in silence for a moment, the only sounds the lapping of water against the shore and the distant call of birds in the trees surrounding the property. David started talking without preamble, his words coming out in a rush like he'd been holding them back for too long. He told me he'd been uncomfortable with Amanda's decision to name the baby Lily Rose from the moment she'd first suggested it. He had tried to talk her out of it, had pointed out how painful it would be for me and Michael, had questioned whether it was really about honoring memory or about something else entirely. Amanda had been furious at his objections. David said she'd accused him of not understanding family bonds, of being willing to let precious memories die just because they made people uncomfortable. She'd painted his concerns as selfishness, as a failure to appreciate the significance of preserving family legacy. The arguments about the name had been some of their worst conflicts in 5 years of marriage, but what really disturbed David was a conversation he'd overheard about 6 weeks ago, when Amanda had been on the phone with someone he didn't recognize. She'd been in the nursery thinking he was still at work, and he'd come home early to surprise her with dinner. As he walked up the stairs, he'd heard her voice carrying through the partially open door, and something in her tone had made him stop and listen rather than announce his presence. David pulled out his phone as he told me this story, his hands shaking slightly as he navigated to a voice recording app. He said he'd started recording that conversation once he realized what Amanda was discussing, that some instinct had told him this was something that needed to be documented. He looked at me with an expression that was part guilt and part desperation, asking if I wanted to hear what his wife had really said about naming their daughter after my dead child. My heart pounded as David hit play on the recording. The audio quality was muffled, clearly captured from outside a room, but Amanda's voice came through clearly enough to understand every word. She was talking to someone about inheritance strategy, about how the baby's name was just the first step in a larger plan to ensure she got her fair share of family assets. In the recording, Amanda laughed as she described how perfectly her strategy was working. She talked about Dad's reaction to the name announcement, how emotional he'd gotten, how she could see him already thinking of this baby as a replacement for the granddaughter he'd lost. She said the name was brilliant psychological manipulation, creating a situation where Dad would feel obligated to provide for this new Lily Rose's future. The person on the other end of the call, whose voice was too quiet to make out clearly, apparently asked about me, because Amanda's response made my blood run cold. She said I was too wrapped up in my own grief to see what was really happening, too focused on my loss to recognize strategic family planning when I saw it. She talked about me with a casual cruelty that suggested she'd never really cared about my feelings at all, describing my grief as self-indulgent and my attachment to Lily's memory as unhealthy. But the worst part of the recording came when Amanda started talking about the lake house. She laid out her entire plan with the kind of detail that showed she'd been thinking about this for months, maybe years. The house was worth close to $300,000, she said, and Dad had always planned to leave it to me because I was the older daughter and had supposedly taken better care of it. But with a new baby named after his dead granddaughter, Amanda was confident she could convince Dad to split the inheritance equally. In the recording, Amanda explained her reasoning with chilling logic. Dad wouldn't be able to resist the emotional pull of ensuring little Lily Rose's future was secure. The name itself would make it impossible for him to favor me in his will without feeling like he was betraying the memory of my daughter. By naming her baby after Lily, Amanda had created a situation where any inheritance decision that favored me would look like Dad was choosing the memory of a dead child over the needs of a living one. The recording continued with Amanda discussing specific tactics for approaching Dad about updating his will. She planned to frame it as securing her daughter's future, as making sure family assets were distributed in ways that served current needs rather than old assumptions. She would position herself as the responsible parent planning for her child's welfare, while subtly suggesting that I was too stuck in the past to think about practical matters like financial security. What made the recording even more damning was Amanda's tone throughout. She wasn't conflicted or uncertain about her manipulation. She was proud of it, pleased with her own cleverness in finding a strategy that seemed emotionally meaningful while serving her financial interests. She talked about using Dad's grief as leverage, about exploiting family sentiment for personal gain, with the casual confidence of someone who had no doubt about the morality of her actions. When the recording ended, I sat in stunned silence, trying to process what I'd just heard. This wasn't suspicion or interpretation. This was Amanda in her own words, laying out exactly what she was doing and why. Every concern I'd had over the past few weeks, every instinct that had told me something was wrong, was confirmed by this recording. My sister had deliberately chosen to name her baby after my dead daughter as part of a calculated scheme to manipulate inheritance decisions. David was watching me carefully, his expression miserable as he waited for my reaction. He said he'd been carrying this recording around for weeks, not knowing what to do with it. Part of him had wanted to confront Amanda immediately, to demand she change the baby's name and admit what she was really doing. But another part of him had been paralyzed by the implications of what the recording revealed about the woman he'd married. He told me he'd tried to convince himself there might be some other explanation, some way to interpret Amanda's words that made them less damning. Maybe she was just venting frustration, exaggerating her strategic thinking in a moment of stress. Maybe the pregnancy hormones had affected her judgment, making her say things she didn't really mean. But deep down, David knew the truth. The woman on that recording was the real Amanda, the calculating person who had always existed beneath the warm, effusive exterior she showed the world. The birth of the baby had forced David to make a decision about what to do with the recording. He couldn't let Amanda continue manipulating Dad using their innocent daughter as a pawn, but he also couldn't expose his wife's scheme without destroying his marriage and his family. So he'd come to me hoping I would know what to do, how to handle this revelation without causing more damage than Amanda's manipulation already had. As we sat on that deck overlooking the lake, I felt a strange mixture of vindication and horror. I'd been right about Amanda's motives, right to document her behavior and question her stated intentions. But having proof of her manipulation didn't make the situation any better. My sister had used my daughter's death as a tool for financial gain. She had turned Lily's memory into a weapon against me, and she had done it all while claiming to honor family bonds and preserve precious memories. I asked David why he was telling me all this now, what he expected me to do with the information. He said he didn't know exactly, but he felt I deserved to understand what was really happening. He also said he couldn't keep living with the knowledge that his daughter's name had been chosen as part of a scheme rather than out of love. Every time he looked at baby Lily Rose, he thought about the recording, about the cold calculation that had gone into selecting her name. David also admitted something that surprised me. He said he'd started documenting other things Amanda had said and done over the past few months, keeping notes on his phone about conversations where she'd discussed inheritance strategies or made comments about Dad's will. He'd been building a case without quite realizing what he was doing, collecting evidence that showed a pattern of manipulation extending far beyond just the baby's name. He showed me some of these notes on his phone, dated entries that tracked Amanda's evolving strategy. There were references to conversations where she'd casually mentioned to Dad how expensive childcare was, how important it was to have family financial support when raising children. There were notes about times she'd brought up the lake house in seemingly innocent contexts, asking questions about property values and maintenance costs that were clearly designed to plant seeds about future inheritance discussions. One note particularly stood out. It described a conversation from 2 months ago where Amanda had told David she was thinking about suggesting Dad set up a trust fund for baby Lily Rose, something that would ensure the child had financial security throughout her life. David had questioned why she was thinking about this before the baby was even born, and Amanda had snapped at him that she was just being responsible, planning ahead for their daughter's future. But the note included David's observation that Amanda's real interest seemed to be in establishing the baby's claim to family assets before Dad made any final decisions about his will. Reading through David's notes, I realized that Amanda's manipulation had been far more extensive than I'd suspected. She hadn't just made one strategic decision about the baby's name, she'd been running a months-long campaign to position herself as the more deserving daughter, the one whose children needed and merited family financial support. The baby's name was just the most visible and emotionally resonant element of a much larger scheme. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the lake, David and I discussed what to do with the evidence we'd accumulated. He was willing to testify about what he'd witnessed and recorded, but he was also terrified about what it would mean for his marriage and his relationship with his daughter. If we exposed Amanda's manipulation, she would never forgive him for the betrayal. His daughter would grow up knowing that her father had revealed her mother's scheme to the family. The personal cost of telling the truth was almost unimaginably high, but David also said he couldn't let Amanda succeed in her manipulation. It wasn't just about the money or the inheritance, though those things mattered. It was about the principle of using a dead child's memory as a tool for personal gain. It was about the corruption of family bonds for financial advantage. It was about ensuring that his daughter grew up in a family built on honesty rather than calculated deception. I told David I needed time to think about how to handle this information. The recording was damning, but using it would mean bringing family conflict into the open in ways that couldn't be undone. Once Dad heard Amanda's words on that recording, he would never see her the same way. Our family would be fractured by the revelation, relationships damaged beyond any easy repair, but as I drove home from the lake house that evening, I kept thinking about Lily. My beautiful, honest daughter who had never understood manipulation or cruelty, who had loved everyone with the kind of open-hearted trust that children possess before the world teaches them to be guarded. Amanda was using Lily's memory to hurt people, to manipulate family relationships for money. That felt like a desecration of everything my daughter had been. When I got home, I found Michael in Lily's room, which we'd left exactly as it had been the day she died. He sat on her small bed, surrounded by stuffed animals and children's books, his face wet with tears. He did this sometimes when the grief became overwhelming, seeking comfort in the physical space where our daughter had slept and played and dreamed her small child dreams. I sat beside him and told him everything. About the recording David had played for me, about Amanda's calculated manipulation, about the cold, cruel way she'd discussed using Lily's name as a tool for securing inheritance money. Michael listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening as I described what Amanda had said about our grief and our daughter's memory. When I finished talking, Michael was quiet for a long time. Then he said something that crystallized everything for me. He said that Lily had deserved better than this. She had deserved to be remembered with love and honesty, not to have her name turned into a weapon or a pawn in family financial disputes. If we let Amanda succeed in her manipulation without challenge, we were allowing our daughter's memory to be corrupted by something ugly and mercenary. That night, lying in bed and staring at the ceiling, I made my decision. I was going to expose Amanda's scheme, no matter what it cost. I was going to make sure Dad understood exactly what his younger daughter had done, how she had exploited his grief and manipulated his emotions for personal gain. And I was going to ensure that Lily's memory was protected from being used as a tool for anyone's selfish purposes. The recording David had given me was just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, I would gather more evidence, document more conversations, build a case that was so overwhelming that Amanda couldn't deny or explain away what she'd done. I would be strategic and careful, waiting for exactly the right moment to reveal what I knew. What I didn't realize was that Amanda was about to make a mistake that would give me the perfect opportunity to expose her manipulation in the most public and devastating way possible. She was so confident in her strategy, so certain that I was too grief-stricken to see what she was really doing, that she had become careless. And that carelessness was about to cost her everything she'd been plotting to gain. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would change our family forever. The evidence was accumulating, the witnesses were ready, and the truth was about to come out in ways that would shock everyone who heard it. Amanda had played a dangerous game with family bonds and precious memories, and she was about to discover that some things are too sacred to be used as tools for manipulation. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.